Welcome to today's webinar, Exploring Free Expression on Campuses Today. The topic is an extension of last week's discussion about generative AI and the hurtful impact of Microsoft's human-like app called Sydney, an offspring of Bing. The parallel is what we hear is occurring in our schools and universities, faculty being muzzled, if not fired, for hurting students, that is making them feel unsafe by discussing viewpoints deemed unacceptable. You've been invited as representing the very pinnacle of inquiry, those of you, and that being Francis and Mark and Sinclair. You're our philosophers, never too shy to ask big questions, to explore ideas and what, how, and why we think. You are by definition liberal, open-minded. Your predecessors are the sources of the sciences and the professions, the arts and the humanities. And you've worked within an environment declaring academic freedom, which should give you a wide range of opportunity for exploring and for teaching. So welcome. Welcome, Francis. Welcome, Mark. Welcome, Sinclair. And welcome when you show up, Mark Anilski. So let's start by asking each of you a big question, a really big question. Who are you and why such a fuss? Mark Mercer, you go first, then Francis. I'll call on Mark and Sinclair to wrap up the introductory phase. Go ahead, Mark.
Thank you, Perry. I'm Mark Mercer. I teach philosophy in Halifax, Nova Scotia. Been here about 23 years now. I work mainly in philosophy of mind and epistemology, and I enjoy ancient philosophy. I came to the realization early in the 2000s that there were some problems with university administrators and freedom of expression on campus and academic freedom. Now, I admit that was fairly late in my career, and there had been warning signs when I look back at things that happened in the 80s when I was a student, and then the 90s when I was a young professor. But I didn't quite understand how severe these things were. I mean, the problems of political correctness were clear for people to see in the 90s, and yet I didn't really catch on that it was going to be turn into such a problem. But in the early 2000s, it dawned on me something happened at my university that I thought was anti-freedom of expression on campus, anti-inquiry. And so I wrote to the administrators at the university about this. My thought was, well, if you explain how they have strayed away from academic values and the academic mission of the university, they'd say, oh, yes, well, in the heat of the moment, I got carried away. And of course, we're going to come back and change that. But that isn't what happened at all. Fairly soon after that, I realized that there are different views about what the university is for, what the university is to do. And my idea that we're there as open-minded people trying to understand how the world is and interpret it really isn't the majority view, at least among administrators. And so I found this organization, Society for Academic Freedom and Scholarship. It had been around, I don't know, 10 or 15 years before I joined. I became president of that organization in 2015, and I'm in my 8th year as president of that organization. And we write letters to universities when we believe that they've offended against principles such as merit principle in university or academic freedom or freedom of expression on campus. We sponsor talks and events. We have an annual general meeting, newsletter, things like that. So that's who I am, and that's what I've been doing.
Okay, thank you, Mark. We'll come back to the balancing act that exists between safety and how one interprets safety and the freedom of expression and when they clash. Francis, you're probably the more controversial individual at the table today, given what's going on in Canada at large, but tell us a little bit about who you are and your perspective on why the fuss.
My name is Francis Widdowson. I'm a political scientist, not a philosopher, but I did have a minor in political theory, which is basically political philosophy. I'm a big fan of Bertrand Russell, who is just an amazing philosopher. And I'm interested in philosophy generally. And I have been sort of battling freedom of expression, academic freedom issues. Actually, it started, I was a policy analyst in the government of the Northwest Territories, and got into a battle there about the attempts to bring in what was called Aboriginal traditional knowledge and incorporate it into all government policies. Discovered at the time that this was not helpful to environmental assessment processes, and tried to draw attention to this fact. But since I was a government employee, I was suspended for doing that, for breaching the duty of loyalty. And so I thought it would be a good thing, since I have a desire to want to state what I think is true, that it would be a very good idea for me to go into the university system to share my knowledge with professors in Canada. And it was a very, very difficult process to do this with respect to Indigenous policy. And I did get my PhD because of Leo Panich, who is one of the, he died a couple of years ago, but he was one of the most famous socialists in Canada, but was a true academic, and didn't agree with me. We fought constantly, but he said, you have enough evidence that you have provided for your arguments, and I think it should go forward for debate. And he stood behind me with respect to that. So that really gave me a lot of confidence when I got my PhD. So I was very, very bold throughout my university career, and I really thought that I would be protected. And I didn't censor myself at all, as Sink will attest to. And I used to raise questions all the time at various meetings. And then starting in about 2015, people started to get more and more angry about this. And they basically treated me like a flat earther, showing up at meetings demanding that the roundness of the earth be explained. That's how I was kind of treated, when we had decided upon things which had no discussion, had no rationale, seemed to be highly damaging to the academic mandate of the university, but the decisions had already been made, and it was just a matter of disseminating what was perceived to be true to the entire university.
Let me shift now to Sinclair, and then we'll come back. Sinclair, about you and why the fuss from your perspective?
First, thanks for having me on, Perry, and hello, everyone. I'm Sink McRae. I'm a philosopher. I went to school at Queen's, Dalhousie, and U of T, and I taught at the University of Manitoba and University of Calgary, each for a couple of years. I've been at Mount Royal University in Calgary for 26, going on 27 years. My area of expertise is something called axiology, which is the study of value that includes ethics, prudential value, welfare theory, and also perfectionist value and aesthetic value. I come to this topic of academic freedom, especially in the last maybe 8 years or something like that, from the perspective of professional ethics. So I was actually hired to teach business ethics and professional ethics. And one of my interests is in the professional ethics of my colleagues, actually, of faculty. And I've become more and more concerned about the I guess, infringement on rights to academic freedom among faculty. And I'm especially concerned about the limited oversight of faculty in the system and the failure, frankly, of administration to execute their role to ensure that there's some kind of control over the actions of faculty as well. So that's what I'm up to.
Well, it seems that each of you have experienced something somewhat similar, and that is the challenges that the university seems to be facing in being able to maintain this open-mindedness to allow free discussion, which I would think within a philosophy department, or even political science for that matter, would be the essence of why universities exist, is to allow the breadth of discussion warranted in order to advance our government, advance our policies, advance our understandings. This tension is not unique to universities, and we'll be exploring that next week. But is it getting worse? I'll ask Mark sort of weigh in here, because you're studying this really on a Canada-wide basis. Rather, you cited your own personal experience, but you were noting you were in an organization that's watching this as a trend or otherwise. How broad is this, Mark?
It's very broad. I don't have figures, so I can't tell you exactly how broad, and we don't have the history either. But to my mind, it has been getting worse. That more universities are becoming less friendly to freedom of expression, less friendly to the university as a place where people try to investigate things as best they can. The problem, I think, is that universities serve a large number of functions. Their purpose is one thing, and then they serve a large number of functions. One of the functions they serve is to prepare young people to take their place in the professional managerial elite. And the concern there is that people who are to take places in the professional managerial elite are to be representative of society as a whole. And the concern then is that there's a leaky pipeline, that students are leaving universities because they don't like it, they're uncomfortable, one reason or another, and thus not getting the credentials needed to be civil servants and doctors and the like. Now, I don't know how true that is. I don't know if that's in fact the case, but I think that seems to be the rationale. To say something like, we want to make the university a place that's welcoming to people from historically marginalized groups, welcoming and friendly to them. And then the thought is, well, there better be caps on what people can say or how they can say it, or else we won't be, or else the pipeline will remain leaky. Now, there's a couple of worries about that. One is that it infantilizes the students, that they aren't able to speak freely and speak their minds, or hear what other people have to say without suffering some sort of psychological damage. And on the other, when they come to university, maybe they come to university in order that they have a university education. So I worry that for many administrators, the goal is to change the university in such a way that it's not a university anymore, and then that's not doing much of a favor to anyone.
Is this issue, Mark, unique to public institutions? Are private institutions going through the same tension? I know we don't have a lot of private institutions here in Canada, more so in the US, but is this unique to the public institution?
Well, I don't think it is, but again, yeah, we don't have a lot of private institutions in Canada, and they often have a different mission than the stated missions of the public institutions. But there is the coming of preferential hiring and restricted hiring, and I don't think that issue is entirely removed from freedom of expression and academic freedom. And the private institutions are, some of them are now engaging in preferential hiring and restricted hiring. So I suspect it's there as well, but again, I don't have much evidence.
So Sinclair, I'm going to throw the next one at you, and then I'll come to Francis. It seems to me that we've been politicizing, I don't mean we, but society seems to be politicizing everything from gender to who's victims to now politicizing how universities behave. That is, as politics change and popularity shifts, so the wind has an impact on how universities are expected to behave. Recently, as a byproduct of what has transpired that Francis has been through, a opinion article in the Edmonton Journal appeared where one of the professors on campus said, you know, enough is enough. Government is now butting in and providing guidelines to university on what they would consider necessary in order for the environment to be safe. Now, a public institution, maybe government feels it doesn't endorse academic freedom, that it's got to be politically aligned with whatever party happens to be in power. Sinclair, am I getting it wrong? Or
a couple of things. First of all, about the observation about government. If you look at the role of professions in our society, you can see a pattern emerge, which is that whether you're talking about mortgage brokers or insurance agents or physicians or accountants or faculty, professors, there's usually a call for government to step in to regulate when self-regulation fails.
Mm-hmm.
And typically the response, and you're seeing that now in the academic system, is that government's not going to be able to do that. So there's always pushback from whatever profession we're talking about. And what faculty will say is that we're best able to do that, but they miss the point, which is the reason why government feels the political pressure to step in the first place is because of failure of self-regulation among, in this case, faculty. So watch for that to happen. What I predict is there's going to be a reframing of the debate as political interference by the government. In fact, the president of my institution at a meeting I recently attended made this very point. But I think what those analyses miss is the underlying problem. And that gets to the second point that you were raising actually at the beginning of your question to me, which is that I see the politicization of what's happening in society in general as part of a broader breakdown of social norms that support the broadly speaking reason, the scientific project, the Enlightenment project, and we're seeing the outcome of that, the rise of disinformation on one side, for example, and the rise of the cancel culture that is leading to greater alienation and, I guess, a polarization of public discourse and private discourse as well. And we're trying to come to terms with that. And I think that there's an underlying problem that is one of the symptoms of the threat to academic freedom is the deeper threat to reason, scientific method, Enlightenment project. That's what we're seeing play out now, I think.
Well, the Enlightenment, and that is the emergence of the humanities and the recognition of the individual post the age of reason, didn't take into consideration the sensitivities that we're feeling today around feelings. That at one time we talked about physical damage, now we talk about psychological damage, and I'm not sure it's damaging just because there's a disagreement in a discussion of what may or may not have taken place in history, and that becomes grounds because someone's, quote, feelings have been, quote, hurt. Whether they've been damaged or not is another matter. Francis, you've been in the middle of this. Have you been accused of doing psychological damage?
Yes, psychological injury because of hurt feelings. So this is a huge, and talking about change in the university, you wouldn't hear this 10 years ago. You wouldn't have heard it 10 years ago. So it's been a change in the last 10 years. But the process has been unfolding since the 1960s. So what happened, and this is feeds into what Sink was talking about, and to some extent Mark, is there was an assault on the Enlightenment project in the 60s by sort of a current of thought referred to as, now it's generally referred to as postmodernism, which denied the ability of people to pursue an objective truth. And so it was like everyone had their own truth. And that's why feelings has become so central now, is because when you knock out the idea that there's an objective truth to be pursued, then what you have left is sort of, individual sentiments and so on. As well, what happened is that the postmodern turn, as they call it, allowed activism to gain a foothold in the institution, in the academic areas, in programs which often are called grievance studies or advocacy studies programs, beginning with Black and women's studies and then going on to Indigenous and queer and disability studies. These programs are not academic, they're activist programs. And then you had collaboration between the activist academics in those programs with bureaucrats in universities. And those bureaucrats and academics, not academics, like activist, scholar activist types, they have taken over the machinery of institutions now. So all you hear about now is the impact that you're going to have on how people feel, especially how members of certain groups which are singled out as being very, very important for a university's brand. So at my own university, Mount Royal University, the slogan is "You belong here," which is kind of ironic because they're not talking to me. I don't belong there.
Yeah,
'cause
well,
inspired
that raises a very interesting perspective on safety, because safety, if it is in fact in the charter, and if safety is important to all of us, I mean, Maslow would certainly say it is fundamental. Doesn't safety apply to faculty as much as it does to students? And where's the balance? Where's the blind judge that ensures balance in safety of both parties? Go ahead, Mark.
Perry, I'm against balance. I'm for for the academic mission and academic values. You know, there's something that I think I learned from Sync that's I take to be quite important, and that is that even if people are harmed or injured by what others say, that harm or injury is not wrongful harm or wrongful injury. When you step onto a university campus, you're consenting to be part of the university community to engage in topics, to talk about things. And it's possible that you'll hear things that cause you hurt and pain, but you haven't been wronged by hearing these things. You haven't been blindsided. That's part of what it is to be part of a university community. I think even if I agree that many of these claims are exaggerated, even if it is true, and I know in my own case, many times I've felt pretty bad because of what people say. At a university, we take things that matter to us, parts of our identity, we hold them at arm's length, and we expose them for others to talk about critically. So that's part of the deal. And so if you start to think about balancing that against safety, well, already you've given over academic values and the academic mission.
Go ahead, Sinclair, jump in. You've got a point to make there.
Yes, we also have to distinguish between the figurative use of language and its literal use. So often there's been an inflation. There's a long history, not a long history, but a recent history of about 10 years ago. I think I read the first article where I read something about this. And for the people who are listening, if you haven't read the book, The Coddling of the American Mind by Jonathan Haidt and Greg Lukianoff, I certainly recommend it. That they coined the expression emotional safetyism in that book. And they make the argument that there's been over a period of about 40 years in the history of psychiatry, inflation as it applies to concepts like trauma and harm. So we have to be really careful as well when we're talking about harm, if we're talking about it literally or if we're talking about it figuratively. And it's basically a way of suppressing discussion to invoke concerns about harm, often inflated concerns about harm. And also it's just as Mark was alluding to earlier, it's also highly patronizing and insulting to suggest that some people cannot tolerate hearing ideas with which they agree and they need to be protected. So usually the way this is framed is the people who are worried about harm are of course not worried about harm to themselves, but it's always paternalistic. It's always a worry about a harm to other people. And that's just highly patronizing and insulting.
Well, it would seem to me that it isn't the university that's changed on its own initiative. It's changing in response to these environmental pressures. And maybe we have a changing student. You talk about coddling. I'm wondering whether or not there should be more time spent in preparing students for university, for what's to be expected. I can recall when I went to Colgate, New York, we went through a bit of an orientation. Philosophy and religion was one of our first courses, which sort of prepared us for a whole array of challenges to our faith, challenges to what we had believed in, that this was going to be the richness and the excitement. I get goose pimples just thinking about it. To go into an environment where you would literally have an opportunity to challenge your perspectives was exciting. But today, it's being viewed as insulting and worth fighting back. So should we be really admitting students to an environment of challenging. Why does the university have to change? Why can't we do a better job in filtering or having a pre-academic orientation? And what's going on in the schools to prepare people for this? Does it start that early? Go ahead, Francis.
Definitely. So that's where it starts. So in the K-12 system, you have this is deeply entrenched now into the K-12 system of hurt feelings, guarding against hurt feelings, you know, sort of the idea that everyone gets a prize, like that kind of sentiment, which comes from a good intentions, that you don't want people to feel left out and be thinking that they're somehow inferior to someone else and so on. But at the same time, the idea of excellence, striving for excellence, having standards which you're trying to rise to meet, that is being diminished all the time. And I really think the main kind of development that's happened is this kind of assault on the Enlightenment, which has taken place, where we really do not have any concern for sort of the objective kind of thing that we all share. So we have understood things that we understand all together, things that we are talking about so that we can figure out what we value, and then encouraging people to meet that sort of commonly accepted standard. That has all been knocked out in the 1960s, beginning in the 1960s. And so now we don't really have any grounding anymore. And so that is really what has allowed this kind of concern with subjectivity, with feelings, with, you know, I'm hurt, therefore everyone should somehow run around and make sure that I'm not hurt anymore.
But
and that's a very difficult thing to try to address.
What you've just described, from what I hear, is the lack of objectivity, the lack of discipline, the lack of standards. This sounds to me like anarchy. And we were saying to the world at large, you're free to do whatever you want to do. And if anybody insults you, you have every right to fight back. We're breaking up. We're either breaking up into a society of a billion individuals running in all sorts of different directions without regard to social responsibility or accountability, or we are all becoming lemmings, or they are all becoming lemmings, following one perspective, which is there's nothing more valuable in the world than the ego in the person. This is anarchy and sheer chaos. Mark Sinclair, you want to jump in further?
Yeah, so there's some interesting research. I'm not a social scientist, but I've read some interesting research by people like Jean Twenge, for example, that a complicated story, but partly as a result of the impact of the distraction device on young people today, they're entering the higher education system less well prepared and roughly 2 to 3 years behind in their emotional and social development. And coupled with that is an ongoing attack really in our society on values like competition, merit, excellence, responsibility. My own view about education is that the primary benefits are intrinsic, and they're explained in terms of the cultivation of self and other regarding virtues that one acquires as a result of going through the process of becoming an educated and enlightened person. And if there are not societal supports for the development of things like persistence, determination, industriousness, resilience, then that's going to lead to a general breakdown in our culture. And that's what we're seeing. My students are just not as well prepared as they were 25 years ago. The best students, the very good students, they're just as good as they were 25 years ago. In fact, for as long as I've been in the system, but the average student, definitely you can see that. I have a no distraction device for a policy, for example, in my classes to try to do something against that. But until we come to terms with distraction devices and other things like that in our society, we're gonna have some hard times.
Yeah, I was made aware recently of how short the attention span is, and some blame that on technology, and how there is only one personality. That's the personality on their cell phone, or whatever personality they wish to structure on that cell phone. Well, all of this is about enhancing personalization, that there is only one thing of any relevance to the world, me and my feelings. I I think it was Randall on chat made a comment that I have truth, you have opinion, and I'll fight for the death for my truth, and you can have your opinion. Goodbye if I don't agree with it. So long. Now I took a look at the ranking, Sinclair, you and Mark. Clearly, you've had students that aren't particularly happy with your styles. I think the word awesome shows up, but it's countered by a few, quite a few, and not a large number. I mean, very few, using the word rude. That somehow, when you, in your pedagogical manner, are getting students to think, they feel insulted. They feel somehow you're attacking them as opposed to working towards some common end and using questions to get there. How difficult it must be as a professor in a room with so much diversity. When I did some research a few years ago of the professions in Alberta, asking whether the patient had changed. They said dramatically. The patient is now armed with information, thinking that they know before they come in. Now they want a relationship, so they've got to develop relational skills in order to become a partner in imparting knowledge onto them that will modify their behavior so they can be a good patient again. The students are changing, and the professions are being forced to change with them in a market. I see you nodding your head, Mark. Jump in again.
I'm not sure I agree. First of all, you're talking about anarchy. I wouldn't mind if our universities, and I don't want to speak to other institutions in society, but I wouldn't mind if our universities were more anarchic. There's, to my mind, too much oversight and control from on high. We propose a new course. It has to go through the department. That's fine. Then up to the dean, then up to a committee, then up to the academic vice president. And so there's much too much oversight and control. I think we'd be happier if the professors were allowed to teach and the students were allowed to be in the classrooms without all that oversight. So the other point is,
well, have our institutions become overly sensitive to protest? I mean, be careful when you protest. You may end up getting exactly the opposite of what you expect, which is more discipline, more authority, more rules.
Well, no, that's right, In the old days, I don't know, 25 years ago, the thought was that university administrators went with whatever way the wind was blowing, that what they wanted to do was maintain their position and their power. Nowadays, I think that a good number of them, probably the majority, are actually true believers, that it's not that they're reacting to pressures and they react one way or the other, depending on how the wind is blowing. I think now they do think of the university as a place that has certain responsibilities. It's to be an institution that leads among other institutions, and so it's to show other institutions like business how to be a diverse and inclusive society. It's to get the students through, and of course, still the financial problems. They want to put students in seats. But maybe I'm disagreeing with Sinclair. I don't think my students are much of the problem, and it might just be that my students in the courses that I teach. Many of the students are feeling the same pressures that professors such as Sink and myself are feeling as well, that they're aware that there are pressures on them not to speak their mind if by speaking their mind they might upset someone, that this might harm their standing in the university. So I think that self-censorship within the classroom is a problem. The problem is really a matter of culture within the institution. I think that even if you have the very best rules and structure and all that, if there isn't the will on the part of the administrators and the professors and the students to use the opportunity as an academic opportunity, then it's not going to mean that much. So I don't mean to inject another note of pessimism here, but I think it's the culture that has to change rather than the structures of the institutions. Changing the structures of the institutions may help the culture to change, and it certainly might go a long way towards protecting professors such as Francis, if academic freedom and tenure were again understood to be as important as they are, that would help. But really, it has to be a cultural change, and I don't know how to bring that about.
I'm going to call on Sinclair and then Francis and make an observation right here. When you talk about self-censorship, my wife is from the Czech Republic. She talked about living in the Czech Republic under communism, where self-censorship was fundamental almost to stay alive. That you had two personalities, what you talked about at home, if you had a home that was nurturing, and how you behaved in a classroom or elsewhere were two entirely different, because in one instance you needed to be politically correct, or the consequences could be severe. Go ahead, Sinclair.
Sure. Yeah, Mark was kind to me and gracious before crediting me for something that he was mentioning. I've learned tons of things from Mark has a number of articles, but I just want to say, Mark, I don't think we are actually disagreeing about this, because I'm immensely sympathetic to my students. I gave a presentation last year on some data on the effect on students speaking in the class, and I'm sure other teachers have noticed that. Especially the things that we talk about, that they're very much more reluctant to speak up in class. And interesting, one thing that the research showed was that students are afraid of they're afraid of their professors, but they're more afraid actually of their peers, and they're afraid of being excluded. So I have lots of sympathy for that. But about the technology and the cultural thing, I read an interesting study. I think, Rob, you had a question about distraction devices. There's an interesting study I read about. They've been collecting data on high school seniors in the United States since about 1976 in this one stream of research. And they asked the high school seniors in 1976, how much time do you spend on what they call legacy media, TV, newspapers, magazines, radio? And there was a lot of alarm at the time, because students were spending 2.5 hours on average per day on legacy media in 1976. And this is outside of anything that they did in their work or school lives. But of course, now they've done the research from 2016, and then they've updated it for 2020 and 2021. And they've contrasted legacy media with, I forget the term they use, but social media platforms, video gaming, what are the other ones? Texting. And that's gone up from 2.5 hours to over 8 hours per day. Think about that for a second. That's 8 hours per day, every day of the week. For high school seniors. It's impossible for you to cultivate the self and other regarding virtues of good citizenship and just to live a good life if you're spending 8 hours a day on social media. I mean, we have to playing video games and texting your friends. It's impossible to cultivate the capacity to focus beyond a few minutes if that's the culture that you're living in. So I have tons of sympathy for young people. I'm a father. I have 3 kids myself, but I think somehow as a society, we're going to have to come to terms with this.
So we've entered the metaverse. It's not something in the future. We're there already, when they're spending 8 hours or 1/3 of their day sleeping and 1/3 of their day in the metaverse. We're there. I was speaking to someone recently who runs a tutoring agency, and they were saying this, getting the students to make eye contact has become increasingly difficult. Getting them to learn how to talk with one another other than talking through their cell phones. Francis, you want to jump in there?
Yes, I just wanted to address the question of what, and I agree with Mark about the culture being a problem. I think that's the fundamental kind of difficulty is the culture of the universities is to a large extent hostile to open inquiry and freedom of expression and those kinds of values. And my own view is there's a couple of really significant problems that could, if they're addressed, could combat this to some extent. The first is the unions, the faculty unions, which are completely captured, most of them, as far as I can tell, by this wokeism and identity politics that's become totalitarian, and the idea that you must respect identities or you should just be pushed out of your position. Faculty associations have been completely captured by this mindset, and that makes it very, very difficult for professors because we rely on our faculty associations to defend us if our academic freedom is violated. And what we find is that's not something that can be relied upon, which is very, very frightening for faculty members. The second thing, which I think is really one of the only hopes to try to get the universities back on an intellectual footing, which is organization. So I was just thinking about this in the latest piece I wrote for C2C Journal, is Society for Academic Freedom and Scholarship, which I'm a board member as well, is the most significant organization in Canada for protecting freedom of academic freedom and academic standards. But we're a national organization which doesn't really have very deep roots in the individual institutions. So my view is that the work that has to be done is to go into every university and organize that university to have a kind of a local chapter whereby you can get together like-minded professors and students and even members of the public who are interested to try to develop some kind of community that has the academic values as its focus, and then use that sort of base of support to put pressure on the institution. And that will, I think, make a somewhat more robust kind of defense of the assault that we've been under, definitely for the last 20 or more years.
It seems to me that what you've just portrayed is we've got a one-sided story going on. There is a reluctance to speak up. And I know a professor that I'm having lunch with next week says, look, I've been burned. I'm not interested in getting onto your webinar or having a discussion in public anymore. I've gone silent. I'm bailing out. What are the options on campus when an individual or there's a collective viewpoint among faculty, for example? You've got reconciliation, you've got arbitration, you've got mediation, you've got termination, you've got revolution. Where is there a process, and where is there the champion of a process to try and bring about, I was disciplined for using the word balance before, but I mean, we've got these extremes, and how do you bring this back together again if you don't have a senior administrator or a dean, for that matter, prepared to say, let's step in here and have a fair hearing and see if we can bring about some mediated resolution? Mark, you've probably got the broader perspective on what options we have in front of us, either nationally or in the public or at the university level.
Well, I fear any sort of attempts to do things formally, to create a culture formally. Now, there have to be rules in place, any human institution. But well, let me put it this way: my idea of university people are people who value their own moral and intellectual autonomy. That is, they like to think for themselves. They're able to think for themselves to some degree. It's always always a project to think for themselves and to form values for themselves. And they come together with other people who value their moral and intellectual autonomy. And because of fellow feeling, we don't want to get in the way of other people's expression of their moral and intellectual autonomy as we investigate things in the world. Now, what that means is that we're going to tolerate a lot of, rudeness and bad behavior. Why? Because it's better that the person who is inclined to be rude comes through his own decisions to change his mind rather than changes his mind out of fear. Right? You'd rather, for many of us, we'd rather believe falsely for our own good reasons than to believe truly as a result of social pressures. And so we don't want to put social pressures on people, even though we might accept that by putting social pressures on them, they would come to, the true view, my own view, they'd come to the true view. So we want to create an institution that's really quite open in that way. But the problem is that it's hard to see how it could work these days. So we do need, as you say, the dean or someone who's going to step in, but that would have to be a dean, an academic vice president who is committed to academic values and to the academic mission of the university. And unless we have someone who can bring people together to pursue academic matters through academic values, well, it's not going to work. So again, you want the university to be an open and flexible and not democratic, but concerned with the individual professors and students. But how to bring that about is a difficult and maybe an impossible project.
Well, you've touched on the concept, and we've been dancing around it, of who to trust, whether it be a dean, whether it be the board of a university, whether it be the electorate through the political process. Where does one go today? Because as you've noted, we have some fear in society today that every time you bring the collective together, they're getting hijacked. And that hijack just keeps on pushing us further into this woke world.
You can't trust anyone. Don't trust anyone. It's a way of opening yourself to disaster. Now, most professors are interested in pursuing their work. They're interested in the research they're doing. They're interested in the teaching, and they don't want to be sidetracked by political things. And I think that's one of the reasons why it's got as bad as it has, because people say, well, I'm too busy doing these other things that really matter to me, that are important. And then they discover that they're unable to do them anymore because they didn't stand up when the when the time was right for them to do so. But we want the institution to be where people can enjoy their personalities and their freedom. But that doesn't seem to fit with the idea of the university of mainly administrators and perhaps activists, some students, but not so many, where the institution is credentialing or creating skilled workers or skilled administrators, or something like that.
We have an example of one in Francis, and Francis, you've got your hand up. I mean, you've been in the vice. What's it feel like?
Yeah, so for people who are unaware of my situation, I was fired from Mount Royal University in 2021 for challenging various woke ideas. And then, I guess almost a month ago now, I went down to the University of Lethbridge to give a talk on how wokeism threatens academic freedom. And that caused such an outpouring of opposition that my talk was canceled. And it's quite an interesting case to look at, because I don't think I've seen in Canada anything that extreme before. So this was just pure totalitarianism that was being expressed by faculty members. So the president was weak, very, very weak. And you had a significant activist element in professors and students that made the president put pressure on the president to cancel the talk. The one that's even worse than that I'm aware of in the United States, which people should look at if you want to see what the end game is of all of this, is Evergreen State College. Benjamin Boyce, who was a student at Evergreen, did a 24-part documentary, which is on YouTube, on Evergreen State College. And when I watched that documentary, and I was still employed at Mount Royal at the time, I felt the hair rise in the back of my neck, because I saw things happening there that I was also seeing happening at Mount Royal, not as extreme, but similar kinds of things, such as presidents and other senior administrators sitting down with students in various meetings and encouraging the students to go after professors. This is a very, very serious problem. And then you have other professors who are activist professors who are also using students in this way. And that is when your position at a university starts to become completely undermined, is when you have administrators and other faculty members who are encouraging the students to go after you. And that's what happened in my case. So I had a sense of this was going to occur for quite some time. And then when I went to Lethbridge, that was extreme, because it wasn't hidden at all. People didn't even disguise the fact that they just wanted to completely stop any ideas that they felt made them uncomfortable. That wasn't going to be allowed. And they were rewarded, they were celebrated, they were even thanked by their president, by the president of the institution, who said it was great what they did. And I'm still in shock that that happened, but it is the logical conclusion of where we've been going for the last 30 years or so.
I want to shift gears here, Sinclair, just for a moment. You see if you pick up on this. We are in a world today where obviously we are hypersensitive. What was a metaphor that a bird flapping its wings in Madagascar can result in an earthquake in Arizona, or something to that effect. With social media today, the level of hypersensitivity of a single event occurring can have vibrations affecting that university or that person far beyond what was ever the case before. And it's apparent that our institutions, at least the processes that they've had to mediate conflict, are just not working. And in fact, if anything, they're making the faculty member the victim. The student will always be right. Now, maybe that's market forces beginning to take hold of our public institutions. Anyway, Sinclair, you may or may not address that point. Go ahead.
Yeah, I'll just pick up on that. I mean, one of the interesting things about Frances's experience at Lethbridge is that she didn't actually have to deliver her talk to prove her case. I mean, the events prove the thesis of the talk. And I think that
elaborate, because everyone may not know what you're referring to.
Well, the idea is that I'm paraphrasing Frances, but the talk was how wokeism is destroying or has destroyed the university, something like that. And by not being able to make her case, she proved her point. And Mark's got a nice piece, by the way, on the analysis of the president's argument, such as it was. If you're interested, you should take a look at that. But actually, Perry, just picking up on what you were just saying, I just wanted to express a contrarian point of view, which is that we're talking about how we can improve the system, but the contrarian view is that the game's over and we lost. It happened really, really quickly. So Frances, for example, made some points earlier about how we could do things to bring the idea of the social mission and justified purpose of the university back in force. But the contrarian view here is that, just as both Mark and Frances mentioned, this is what happens in a university when an activist agenda overtakes an academic one. I'm an academic, not an activist. Mm-hmm. I'm not expert in political. I mean, I'm interested in political theory, but I don't have any knowledge about organizing political movements. And that's exactly what's happened at the university. Now, I should be mindful of my own biases here. I'm speaking from somebody who works in a liberal arts faculty. Mm-hmm. So that might be distortion. But from my perspective, I would like to be convinced otherwise, that the game's not already over, because what's happened is a critical mass of people who have their own political ideology, critical theory, now are in a place where they're able to game the system. They can hire people who are in their field, and they can also gain advancement in the field as a result of the approval of other people who share their political views. But I see this as a mask for incompetency, actually. That the attempt to try to limit discussion is really a mask for incompetency. I'll just make one quick other point, which is, I mean, I guess I said it enough right now, but maybe I'll let other people chime in.
No, go ahead, finish the idea, and then I'll call on Frances.
So the idea is that we need some argument for thinking that the system can be rehabilitated. But what if we're in a long, slow decline? For example, I'm worried about what's happening at the primary grades and what's going on in teachers college. Is there any reason for thinking that things are going to go back in the other direction? I mean, the fact that I'm a critic, for example, of my system, but I'm just an accident. It's just an accident that I happen to be there. I'm a dinosaur and I'm going to be retired sooner than later. And the other thing is, nobody would hire me now. If I came up onto the hire, if a 30-year-old version of me came up to be hired, first of all, they would never write my job description, and I have a 0% chance of being hired. I'm not convinced that, you know, the game is done. We lost.
I'm going to come back to that, but Francis, you've got your hand up. Go ahead.
Yeah, and this is an argument that goes on. So Peter Boghossian, who people may or may not have heard of, who's an important figure in the United States, who resigned from Portland State University because he perceived that the universities were over and he was just going to start new institutions. And he said that there's this kind of debate that goes on. Do universities have cancer or do they have rabies? And cancer is, you need serious treatment, you need chemotherapy. And then rabies is it's just, your dog is not your dog anymore, and you have to shoot your dog because it's not able to save them. I don't know the answer to that question, but I think by fighting against it, we can document the decline. So I think even if we are losing this battle, we can do a good service for humanity by showing how things have gone downhill and the causes that have resulted in them having this effect. So that's sort of what I'm doing right now. Is when I went to Lethbridge, it was quite interesting because it was when the talk got canceled, it was sort of, the questions were, what do you want to do? And I was saying, well, and they suggested a Zoom event. And I said, well, I'm happy to do a Zoom event, but I think it's very important that I go onto campus, that I not be pushed off campus. Because if I'm pushed off campus, it allows those activists to have won that particular maneuver. And then when I showed up, you were able to sort of see the character of what we're facing there, which is a completely anti-intellectual, hostile audience who doesn't want to engage at all with the ideas and just wants to stop people from speaking. And it was kind of interesting hearing the perspective of various students who were shutting down the talk. They said, you know, students have spoken, but there was a very small, they're not students. They're a self-selected group of activists who are deciding for everyone else what they are able to hear. And people often forget about that with respect to freedom of expression. Is not just being able to express yourself. It is about the freedom your freedom to hear views that are different from your own, so you can decide for yourself whether these ideas are valid or not. And that really exposed that to some extent. So I think that's an important thing to do.
So if academic freedom is gone, the universities are, at least what their role once was, is dead.
Yes.
In which case one might expect out of the dust some new institution to emerge. Now, the history of universities goes back hundreds of, if not, I think 500, back to Alexandria or whatever. The history there's a long history to it. Are we looking at something unusual in history? I'm going to ask Robert McGarvey if he might weigh in here as a student of neoliberalism, and an excellent article in our last newsletter if you haven't read it. But Robert, do you want to weigh in here and bring us your perspective briefly?
Sure. Thanks, Perry. Wonderful conversation, and I think very timely and important. What I find interesting is this perception or this belief that that universities are, in fact, guardians of free expression. For the longest history of universities, they have not been anything of the sort. They started out as agencies of the Roman Church, and at least for the first 500 years of their existence, they were guardians of orthodoxy, religious orthodoxy and doctrine. And so interestingly, the idea of peer review it's not what it was become, which is guardians of truth and making sure you've covered all the bases. It was there to identify heretics. And that's exactly what has happened to Frances. She has now been identified as a heretic. And it's not that your views are there's no equality of views here. There is virtue in the religious views, and heretical views are a danger to the institution, and they must be exterminated. Now, they don't burn people at the stake anymore, thank goodness, Francis, but it's heading in that direction. The intolerance is growing hourly, daily. And I think you're right. I don't know if the battle is lost. These things are long-term. But my reading of history is that, we've had a massive transformation in what we call philosophical virtue. Summarize, I mean, the Western civilization was, after World War II, considered the great liberator. And Western systems, institutions, and this whole rational process was considered virtuous and was socially supported. And somewhere in the teens, you're right, Francis, it was somewhere around 2012 that there was a complete reversal of philosophical virtue. It transitioned from society at large to the oppressed. And what it did is it left Western civilization in the position of oppressor. And so if you're holding traditional views, or you're perpetuating this rational historical viewpoint, you are part of a great system of oppression, the victims of which are the subject of that. So the idea that you can have such a profound and rapid transition in what is virtuous, what is good, what is reliable, what can be trusted, is astonishing to me. I mean, we haven't seen anything like this for centuries. So I mean, this is an important conversation. I think it needs to continue, but this is deeply philosophical, what's going on.
Well, the oppressor brought law and order to much of the world.
Well, you don't have to argue with me. I know that.
No. I'm echoing. The oppressor recognized the value of the individual. Feudalism came to an end. Humanism emerged. Institutions to protect individual rights emerged. And all of a sudden, those very institutions are being hijacked in the interest of what? In the interest of maybe a small minority. I don't know where the majority is on this topic. I'm not sure the majority is even aware of paying attention. Go ahead, Rob. Unmute.
Yeah, I just wanted to comment that actions like those that we've seen Francis take have a big impact. I've been following Francis's story and watched videotape of her at the assembly where she was prevented from speaking. I noticed at one point, Francis, you were talking to a very large First Nations man and telling him that you weren't the bogeyman, and that you didn't dispute that some harm was done at residential schools, and he was nodding his head and seemed you had him convinced, I think. But in any event, I think actions like yours have a much bigger impact than you might think. I know I've been a lifelong liberal and very much sort of interested in assisting those who are less advantaged than I am, and making sure that people who are vulnerable are looked after. But at some point in the last couple of years, I started realizing that we were on a very slippery slope. I'm a lawyer, And I'm one of the 51 signatories to that petition that required the Law Society to consider repealing a rule that was passed that is very vague in terms of the type of training that can be imposed on lawyers, and so a course called The Path was imposed upon every practicing lawyer in Alberta, which required us to take cultural competency training in Indigenous matters. And while the course itself I thought was quite interesting, I didn't agree with everything that was taught in it. I do object to the kind of pressure placed on an entire profession to basically have imposed on it these political or socio-political teachings. And so, but I know that there is a large number of our populace taking notice of what's happening in terms of this battle against a woke culture. And I encourage you all to continue the battle. I think you would likely underestimate the effect that your efforts are having. Thank you.
Well, that's part of the reason for this discussion is if we can't have it on campus, maybe we can have it off campus. This is not meant to be, and certainly isn't a political entity, but in amplifying dialogue, I think we're trying to make a statement that we ought to have a place that feels safe for all of us, where we can. And as people show up, they tell me the thing they like about what we're doing, and the newsletters is that there aren't very many places they feel they can go to anymore to have an honest and open discussion where an array of views will be tabled without a political agenda. Okay, I'm looking for hands. It's 10 after. Go ahead, Mark.
Well, I wanted to address a few things that Robert McGarvey said. I think he's quite right. There have been many different sorts of things called universities. The tradition of universities is not smooth at all. And one thing I think we can be a little bit thankful for is that the woke forces don't know their history that well, because there are some tremendous models of the university of oversight and control that they could learn from. So it's good that they haven't yet caught on. But yeah, the university as it existed, say from the 50s into the 2000s, was not. There's a minority tradition in the university throughout history that suddenly became close to a majority tradition through those years, but then fell away. Right, the universities are often handmaidens of other institutions and other things used in other ways. And if we want that, I mean, what I think many of us can do now, professors and students, is try to keep alive within our institutions the ideal of academic endeavor, the ideal of dispassionate inquiry, a culture of disputation. It will have to be somewhat secret. It will have to be a bit below the level at which the deans and the others can see, or at least we might have to find some way of keeping what we're doing secret. I have on my syllabus for any course that I teach, I have a link to an article I wrote about freedom of expression in the classroom. And in that article, I ask students that they don't complain to authorities about what they hear from other students and the rest. And there are some students of mine who have said, Mark, it's a wonderful thing, and I feel that we can talk about things here, but just you don't want to have something like Chatham House rule But you do want at the same time to make the students think that the classroom is a very special place, and that they can come there and they can say things, they can float ideas. They don't, maybe nothing they agree with, but find out what the value, the virtues and the vices of the idea is. And if they come into that, and if we keep it kind of quiet, then maybe this idea can survive even into a university of oversight and control.
Thank you. I think it would, from what I've gathered, it would be quite a challenge to keep it secret and to keep it from becoming infiltrated by those that would see this as evil, and contrary to the mission of the university to allow everyone to become a victim. Randall, you've expressed a few points along the way. Is there something at this point you'd like to raise, a question or a comment?
Well, it was a fascinating discussion. It's got my brain working overtime for sure. I've mentioned before in this forum about my concern about information overload as an underlying condition which is driving general anxiety. And people like to convert anxiety to fear, so they try to identify targets that may be causing this background anxiety, and it becomes a witch hunt. And I think that wokeism and cancel culture are, part of this system. They're symptoms of the broader cause. What we have over the last 150 years, even 500 years, is an escalating or exponential growth of information and knowledge. And yet our brain capacity is not growing in proportion. So each of us gets a diminishing portion of the knowledge available. And that means that each of us has to navigate around a lot of uncertainties, things we don't know, don't understand. Our brains are shutting down, but somebody's got to be to blame for it. In my last comment there, I am concerned that this kind of collectivism, mental health condition might lead to some tyrannical order being imposed upon us by governments. Would this lead to a social credit state? And I would like to know what our guests think about that.
Yeah, the social credit state, that certainly seems like the direction that we're headed. That if you must comply with a set of rules, a set of principles, a set of thoughts, it's mind shaping, at least public mind shaping. We have for some months now been looking at the relevance of technology, either taking us into this space or taking us out of it, as a byproduct of what we refer to as the commoditization of knowledge. That with the ChatGPTs, generative AI, et cetera, we seem to have this increasing faith that we can go to a source and get the knowledge that we would otherwise have to get at a university or out of a book or an encyclopedia, that we can go there. And if we are commoditizing knowledge, then what value will emerge as an alternative? And we've been talking about relational, the capacity to work with people. And it's in that regard, and I'm almost into a wrap-up mode here. If we don't have within an institution those that can practice academic freedom, that can have the freedom to think, to look at the array of the forces and sources of change and ask, what is relevant? What do we value? What is so important that it must be preserved? And it seems to me that's the domain of philosophy. That you are the core of what a university should be. It should be the last place that anyone goes into in disciplines. Do you get a sense that you are in fact among the privileged? Or are you, in fact, the enemy to the institution that wants to take it in a completely different direction? Francis, I know your answer, so I'm not going to call on you, but I'll go to Sink because Mark is laughing. Go ahead, Sink.
Oh, yeah, there's no question. I won the job lottery. I mean, it's, luck plays a huge role in our successes in life. And I feel privileged every day to be able to do the kind of thing that I do. But it's interesting, what Mark was saying about this becoming now kind of subversive activity, whereas it used to be championed. That shows you just how dramatic the shift is. I just wanted to make one quick point, which is that my view is that extremists make a living by taking in each other's washing. And it's easy to get pulled into that perspective or that way of framing what's going on here. But I draw a distinction between the idea that we need to have tolerance for a wide spectrum of political views. So I'm happy to debate political theory across that wide spectrum with anybody who's interested in engaging in a pursuit of understanding and the pursuit of justice. So what I'm opposed to is not political diversity or diversity of ideas, just on the contrary. It's the methods that are employed to try to suppress dissent and that try to suppress engagement and discussion. That's the real threat. That's where the threat of authoritarianism and totalitarianism arises. So yeah, it would be great if we had a place where people could just go and exchange ideas on the assumption that we're working together to try to better understand our world.
You know, you've touched on something that I hadn't really given thought to, and that is the value of uncertainty, the value of saying, I don't know. This is not something that we've been promoting for the last century. We've been promoting the hierarchy of the PhD, the hierarchy of I know better than you do. Take your lesson, take your message. It seems to me maybe we need to start telling students that it's okay to not know. It's important to inquire, to be in environments that are searching. Am I touching on anything that's resonating at all with that observation? I just think we've got carried away with, I got to get an A, I got to get 100, I got to be the best in the class, I got to know, I got to prove others as ignorant, as opposed to the wokeism that says, oh, we know who's the problem. It's the we know versus we're not so certain. I'm voting for the we are not so certain, and suspicious of those that are proclaiming to know. I like the dialogue. I like the inquiry.
That's been the shift in ethical leadership, Barry, in the private sector, is this shift from the CEO knowing everything to engaging leadership teams and others.
Right.
Things like scenario planning embraces not knowing and looking at things beyond your control.
Yeah.
I think you have to, I'd like to zoom the conversation out just a little bit away from the pure academic versus activist questions to the nature of our society right now. And we wonder why we're having these sorts of problems when you have a post-truth world. You've got kids with TikTok brain, which is now a diagnosable condition, which rewires them away from being able to learn or remain focused. They can, if they can't even learn right now, can they actually engage in respectful conversation? I'd build on Randall's comments. We have these complex adaptive systems we've built over the last 200 years that we can barely understand, let alone improve. And all of this anxiety that comes along with all of that puts us into fight or flight. Our brains are running in fight or flight, and it's worse for kids 80 to 90% of the time. We were designed, fight or flight was when you ran into an animal in the jungle that was going to eat us. It wasn't supposed to be an operating mode. So if you look at some of those societal conditions, it's not a wonder why we're not having these sorts of issues today.
Excellent. Excellent point.
I just want to talk quickly about three things, and that is we have gone from a state of thinking, because I remember writing papers saying in English, I feel, and my professor wrote in big red, feelings have no place in academic discourse. And I think we've gone from thinking to feelings. Feelings are the operating way now in universities. The second thing is universities have always changed, no addition there. They've functioned as business schools, now they're training institutions, whatever. And thirdly, it was something that Francis talked about, and that is the tribe has spoken, and that is popular culture has to embrace that notion again of thinking as opposed to just feeling. Thank you for an excellent, excellent presentation, everybody.
Thank you, Alona. Jeff, you were nodding your head. You know I'm never going to let you off the hook. You want to share with us any perspectives that you've picked up today? Jeff?
Yeah, Perry, I'll always respond if called upon. I've really enjoyed the conversation from everybody today. And I think, Sinclair, you said something that made me reflect a little bit on And as a fellow dinosaur, I related to what you said. I'm a ex-HR executive. I've worked in 2 colleges and 2 universities as the top HR person. And Francis, you said something about the weakness of leadership. And I think that's at the root of a lot of what we're seeing here within our educational institutions. And I think the weakness of academic leaders and university and college leaders in general. And some of that is, there's a funding tied to that with, government funding of institutions. You saw it recently with Athabasca University, where they weren't towing the line. And I think 4 of their board members were replaced, and now their CEO was replaced. And that all had to do with, where some of their staff were located. And it's a distance university where you would think that working remotely wouldn't be something that was so, far out in left field. But anyways, so I think that accounts for some of that weakness in leadership, is that some of that pressure that they're feeling. And then I think a number of you have talked about the importance of social media. And I think the other factor here is that if the students are spending, as Sinclair suggested, 8 hours a day in various forms of social media, and something else that's happened in education in the past few years is when we made the move to instructor evaluation by students, and someone mentioned it here along the way. I think you did, Perry. And I think that's been a fundamental shift as well. If we start to think of students as customers, and I'm not saying that their opinions aren't important. I'm saying that we've created an environment where we're afraid of our own shadows, and we shouldn't be it should be a meritocracy, right? And I worked in one private university that was, I think, significantly affected by the financial implications of their, ability to raise tuition fees. And it compromised the integrity of some of their admission and graduation decisions. And to me, that was always a real red flag. And then the final thing I wanted to say is that, back to the dinosaur comment, I wonder to what extent anyone feels that any of this is a reflection of a generational shift. And I looked at the room here, and I look at us as all older white, mostly guys. And that, colors our sense of the pressure that we're feeling. And then the last thing I wanted to say is just I know the term wokeism has come up here a few times, and it's one that I always recoil at. I don't like that phrase, because I'm a textualist, if you want to call it that. I like the actual definition of that word, and I don't like that it's being turned into a pejorative. And I wish there were another way of expressing that, other than just sort of defaulting to that word that has become part of our vernacular now.
That's a good point. I totally agree about the term wokeism. I hated it. I avoided using it. And it's just that the other words that are there, totalitarian identity politics, politically correct totalitarianism, reified postmodernism, these are all more academic terms, but they just don't have the same catchiness as woke does. That's why woke has got kind of taken over.
Yeah.
I think there's a lot of really interesting things that were said by audience members. One of them was, well, first of all, there's a kind of mental illness that's going on. Like, I think there's a large amount of mental illness going on because of this disintegration of any kind of common frame of reference that exists, where people can say, okay, this is something that I can orient myself towards, and that's kind of disintegrating. The second one was about the amount of knowledge that is accumulating and the difficulties that poses for people, and how to act. How can you act in this sort of era of uncertainty? Because we don't want to be dogmatic, and we don't want to be too certain. But if we are constantly uncertain about everything, we're kind of lost. And I think that's where philosophy kind of comes into it. And that's why I think philosophy is so important. And that's why it's such a tragedy that philosophy now is really does not play a major role in universities when it should be the master discipline, really, because it's kind of the discipline that allows you to kind of deal with those kinds of questions of uncertainty and how to develop values that may not be the absolute truth, but they're going to have more validity to them than other ways of thinking about things. So I think a restoration of philosophy to its rightful place in the university would go a long way towards dealing with many of these intellectual problems.
Oh, I just wanted to thank everybody for the opportunity to have some stimulating discussion. One of the ironies, I think, actually, of working at a higher educational institution is how few spaces there are where real academic discussion happens. You'd be surprised. For example, we go to a lot of meetings, but the meetings are always structured so that there's very little space for people to have anything like a real discussion. So there's the illusion or appearance of academic discussion, but the reality is that maybe I'm just not invited to them, but the reality, my experience anyways, is there's not a lot of academic discussion that happens, at least among faculty in academic institutions, which is a sad thing, right?
So the world is moving so fast that we spend more time on administration than we do on the reason we exist. Go ahead, Mark.
I was going to address that point, Perry. You're right. Part of the problem is the burgeoning administrations. Now, when I came to St. Mary's, we had a dean. Now we have a dean with 2 associate deans, and we have many people at the vice president level, and it draws resources away from teaching and learning, and it creates an ethos of a managed space. And because it's a managed space, then that prevents people from trying out ideas and thinking and talking with each other. So the problems are deep. The problems are ones of culture. Finally, I think they have to be left to the university, to the professors and the students. Though I don't mind people outside the university talking about the university. In fact, I wish they would do it more often. But the problem is the problems at university are problems within the university, and I don't think that they can be fixed by anybody other than the professors and the students.
That underscores the relevance of leadership internally. Mm-hmm. Francis, I don't want to ignore you. Do you have any last minutes that you want to share with us? And then I'm going to go to Robert.
Yes, and on the leadership, remember the audience was saying about, sort of the failure of leadership. It used to be that university administrators were academics. So they would be academics, they would go and they would do their turn as an administrator for a number of years, and then they would go back and be a professor again. That rarely happens now. And so what you have is you have these professional managers who come in who are just they're trying to get into administration as quickly as they can, and as well the members of the union, often that's why they go into the union, is so that they can have a kind of a stepping off point into administration. So you have these real kind of bureaucratic managerial types who just want to have smooth out all the kind of rancor and any kind of conflict that exists, and sort of just kind of grapple with that, and that really leads to a very stilted kind of academic environment where you don't have the kind of freewheeling give and take which used to be. And I know it's never been a perfect environment, but certainly 20 years ago things were much better in universities than they are today, and that's one of the major causes, is this kind of turn from academic kind of control to this kind of managerial kind of sort of control over universities.
But it seems to be one of the principles, or one of the points that's been made repeatedly today, is we're top heavy, and we've forgotten the very purpose for which the university existed, and it's been compromised. Robert, anything you want to share with us that we have left out?
Well, just I want to thank everyone for an extraordinary conversation. It's another day you hear this level of discourse, and I just as relevant as universities are, this is a much larger problem. What we're working on at Rethinking Capital is what we call a normative reset. That the combination of neoliberalism and various other factors have kind of run their course, and there is a need for new governing orthodoxy for capitalism in Western society. So I think that's really where the conversation needs to go. I think in terms of just getting back to this question of woke, I think we don't describe it in those terms. It is a form of philosophical romanticism. You want to understand it, it goes right back to Jean-Jacques Rousseau and the philosophical sort of principles that he applied. And so we refer to it as neo-romantic, and it suffers all the sort of affairs and logic and the trajectory towards violence that historical romanticism displays.
But as we wrap this up, I want to say thank you to all of you for being here today. Francis, for the courage to do what you've been doing. And I recognize, and I think we all do, that there are people out there that are fighting for a cause. And that cause fundamentally is to restore the role of the institution for the purpose for which it was established, which is to learn, to know, to think. Mark, you've got a broad perspective. Please help us Canada-wide. We need your support. I hope it doesn't have to be secret. And Sinclair, your perspectives were refreshing. You're a student of this topic. I hope to bring you back again someday. But again, thank you, Francis. Thank you, Mark. Thank you, Sinclair.